Hey, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to make a fresh milled einkorn sourdough bread recipe. Fresh milled einkorn sourdough bread, which is a lot to say, is a little bit of a double whammy in the bread baking world, because when you're working with fresh milled flour, there are some adjustments that you have to make. And then when you're working with einkorn flour, there are other adjustments you have to make. So combining them seems like it would be kind of complicated, but the good news is it's actually really easy. So I'll share more about these tips and tricks for working with einkorn flour and fresh milled flour as we bake. But first, let's just get our dough going. The first thing I'm going to do is weigh out 545 grams of einkorn wheat berries. Now, the reason why I measure this in grams rather than in cups is because when you mill wheat berries, if you put, say, 1 cup of wheat berries in your mill, you don't get 1 cup of flour out. Depending on the wheat berry and the size of the grind, you could get 2 cups or 2.5 cups out. But when you mill 545 grams of wheat berries, you get 545 grams of flour. So this is much more precise and much more accurate. Okay, the mill is on, so let's mill our flour. This is on the finest setting possible, which I do recommend when you are making bread with fresh milled flour. So what's nice about milling your flour in grams is now that I have it all milled, I just dump it right in the bowl. There's no more measuring after that, which is super convenient. Now I'm simply going to add 290 grams of water to the flour. So what I think makes working with fresh milled einkorn flour for bread a little confusing is that usually when you're working with fresh milled hard wheat, you need to increase the hydration because that hard wheat absorbs more water. But what makes einkorn flour a little bit funky is that it doesn't have much gluten in it. And because of that, it just can't hold as much water. So people often say things like, working with einkorn flour, it's so sticky. And it is true that dough is a little sticky, and I've often found it to be really clingy, which you'll see in a little bit when we get this dough going. But if you reduce the hydration, it's a little more workable. And because it doesn't need so much water, it doesn't really change the quality of your bread. Okay, let's check out this dough so far. So you can see this is a little bit, it might be hard for you to see. Let's see if I can get you a better look here. There we go. So you can see this is still a little bit dry looking, but that is okay. Because when we're working with fresh milled flour, what we really need to do first is let it rest. Anytime you're making bread with fresh milled flour, I recommend combining the flour and water and then letting it rest for a minimum of 15 minutes. I found for einkorn, 15 minutes is fine, but for other hard wheats like a hard red or a hard white wheat, 30 to 45 minutes does better. So what we're gonna do now is just let this einkorn rest for 15 minutes and absorb that liquid. The process of letting the flour and water sit together is called autolyzing. So while this autolyzes, let's just talk about einkorn flour for a second because it does have some unique properties. If you are familiar with baking bread, you have probably made it with all-purpose or bread flour, at least at some point. And the thing about all-purpose and bread flour is that they have a high gluten content or protein. So gluten is a type of protein. The higher the protein content in a flour, the stronger your dough can be. And it seems a little counterintuitive. You would think that a strong dough would create a tough bread, but a strong dough can hold air pockets. So the stronger your dough, the taller, the fluffier it can get. The thing with einkorn flour is it does not have a lot of gluten. So when we're working with einkorn flour, we do have to adjust our expectations just a little bit. We can't expect it to get a huge giant rise. I do have some hacks for that, which I'm going to show you in this video, but it doesn't rise in the same way as a bread does with all-purpose or bread flour. So you can see this is still a really sticky dough, as you can tell, but that's pretty normal when you're working with einkorn flour. It is a little sticky, and I think more than sticky, it's actually just really clingy. I think clingy is a better word for it. But as we move through the process, it does become more manageable and more workable, and it still will remain a little bit clingy or a little bit sticky, but I'll show you how to manage that as we move through this process. Now we'll just add in 150 grams of sourdough starter. This is actually cold sourdough starter straight out of my fridge. So you can use active or inactive starter. I've said this a lot on my sourdough tutorials. Inactive starter will just take longer to bulk ferment. Active starter will move faster. I fed this, I think it was last night, and then put it in the fridge, so it's probably like half active. The cold temperatures, it doesn't stop the metabolic process of your starter, it just slows it down. So it is theoretically, I would say, an active starter at this point. But either way, you're totally fine. Just put your starter in there and keep going. Then I'm also going to add 10 grams of salt. Salt, of course, adds flavor to your bread, but salt also inhibits yeast. So if we put too much salt in our bread dough, it can make it so it doesn't rise as well. And because of that, I'm using a little less salt than many of my recipes because einkorn already has a hard time rising because of its low gluten content. So I'm sticking with 10 grams and no more just to make sure that this bread gets a nice rise. And now I'm just gonna mix this by hand until everything is combined. Often when you're working with sourdough, like more traditional recipes, they'll talk about using a wet hand to prevent sticking and just to help you work the dough. But I recommend not doing that with einkorn just because if you have too much water in there, it just doesn't work out as well. So just get your hands messy, have a good time. It's like playing with Play-Doh or something, and get everything nice and mixed up. So when you're mixing this dough, you might find that it is a little more stiff than other dough that you're used to. That's pretty normal. I have found that einkorn is just like that, but what it's not is shaggy. This is not a shaggy dough, and you can see as I'm mixing it together, it's hard to tell on camera, but it is a little stiff, but it's not dry and it's not shaggy at this point either. Okay, so this is mixed and combined, and you'll see it's still pretty sticky, but that's really normal for sourdough bread, whether you're working with einkorn or all-purpose flour. So this, I would say, is maybe a little bit stickier than my regular no-knead sourdough bread because that's just how einkorn is, but it is comparable. What we're gonna do is let this sit for 1 hour and absorb any more liquid that is in the dough. And you'll see it becomes much more workable. It'll still be a little sticky, but I have some ways that you can get around that I'm going to show you. So for you, it's gonna be about 2 seconds. For me, I'll see you in an hour. So this is looking pretty good. I know it's probably a little hard for you to tell on camera what this dough looks like, but it has absorbed a lot of that water, and now it is time to do stretch and folds. Now, because einkorn is so clingy, I do recommend taking the dough out of the bowl and doing stretch and folds on the counter, which I'll show you in a minute. But to do that, I recommend 2 things. One, a plastic bench scraper is really helpful because you can use this to scrape the dough off the sides of the bowl and get it out onto the counter. 2, I recommend having a little bit of extra einkorn flour milled. So I milled 445 grams of einkorn flour to make this dough, but often what I do after I mill my flour for my recipe, while I have the mill out and going, I like to mill a little bit extra and then store it in the freezer. So this way I can use this for dusting the counter, putting on top of the dough, rubbing on my hands, and still keeping this a 100% fresh milled flour bread. If you don't have extra einkorn flour, don't worry about it. Just use whatever you have. Throw some all-purpose on there, whole wheat flour, whatever you have. It's going to be okay, I promise. So first things first, I'm going to sprinkle some of this einkorn flour pretty generously onto the counter. This will stop it from sticking to the counter, but also it improves the quality of the dough too. And then I'm going to use my plastic bench scraper to scoop the dough out of the bowl. Now, usually when I do stretch and folds, I do them right in the bowl and I just scoop my hand under, pull the dough up and fold it over. But because this einkorn dough is so clingy, it's just hard to do that. And it works a little bit better to do the stretch and folds on the counter. So if you are familiar with stretch and folds, the sentiment here is the same. You're just doing it on the counter rather than the bowl. So I just like to make sure that it gets enough flour on it so I can handle it. And then I'm just taking the edge farthest away from me, pulling it out, and folding it over. And then you can turn it if you want. Pull it out, fold it over. So now we have it folded like this, and we need to then fold the other sides. And you can see I'm now able to handle this dough pretty easily because it's absorbed some of that liquid, and also because I floured the counter and the top of the dough. It's just easy to handle. So make sure you flour that counter and the top of your dough. So then I'm just going to take the other side, pull and fold. Oops, I tore the dough a little bit, and that's okay. You just pinch it. And I even like to take my opposite hand and just hold the dough down as I pull it away and fold it over. So we're just doing that 4 times, once on each side. I like to tuck it into sort of a nice little rectangle. And so now we have this nice little ball of dough that we can put right back into the bowl. And one thing that I also like to do is when I get to this point, I start flouring the bowl a little bit because that just makes it easier to get that dough out. So just take a little bit of my einkorn flour, sprinkle it in the bowl, and that just makes it a little bit easier to get that dough out for our next round of stretch and folds. Now, what I like about making einkorn sourdough is because it doesn't have a lot of gluten, it doesn't need a lot of stretch and folds. So I do 2 cycles with 30 minutes in between. So in short, I do what I just showed you. I do 4 stretch and folds on the counter, put it back in the bowl, let it rest for 30 minutes, and then I do another set of 4 stretch and folds, and that's it for the stretch and folds. And now we just put this in the bowl, cover it with a damp towel, and we are going to let it bulk ferment until it is about 20 to 30% risen or domed on top. When we are bulk fermenting, what's really important is to watch the dough, not the clock. Mine usually does take about 3 to 4 hours to bulk ferment, but it really depends on the strength of your starter, the temperature of your room. There are a lot of factors that come into play. You might be used to hearing people say things like ferment your dough until it is doubled in size. But here's the thing. Again, einkorn does not have gluten strength to it, so it can't really double in size. So we want a 20 to 30% rise that is domed on top. So we'll get back to this after the bulk fermentation, shape it, get it in the fridge, and go to bed. It is about 9 p.m. So this has been bulk fermenting for 4 hours, and we are ready to shape and get this dough in the fridge overnight. It's a little hard to tell here, especially because I put the dough in the bowl crooked, but it is probably about 30% risen. So it is ready to come out of the bowl. So we are going to just flour the counter and then shape this dough. So again, I am just going to use my plastic bench scraper to get the dough out of here. I'm trying to not deflate that dough ball. I'm just gonna cup my hands around the dough and turn it in a clockwise direction and drag it across the counter toward myself. This creates a little bit of tension and creates a nice tight dough ball. If you are going for a nice rise with your einkorn sourdough bread, I recommend using a 7-inch Banneton basket. So this is a 9-inch, what I normally use, and this is a 7-inch basket. The reason why I recommend a 7-inch basket over a 9-inch is because it's taller. So if you look at these side by side, you can see the 9-inch doesn't have sides that are quite as tall. So you might get a flatter, wider bowl with this, but what we really want is some support for that dough because again, as I've said maybe a million times in this video, it doesn't have that gluten strength. So using a bowl or a Banneton basket with taller sides like this 7-inch Banneton will help that dough hold its shape, giving you a better rise and oven spring later. So I have tried my sourdough einkorn bread in both of these, and hands down, the 7-inch basket was the best all the way around. So we're just gonna heavily flour this Banneton basket. You can use it with the cloth if you want. I've just been liking it this way. I kind of like the swirl pattern. It's got some 90s vibes that I like to it. So I've just been flouring the Banneton basket without the cloth and putting it in there that way. And I also like to flour the top of the dough just to help prevent it from sticking in the basket. And then we just take our plastic bench scraper and put it face down into the Banneton basket. And so you can see that really fills up most of the Banneton, and that dough is really nice and supported. So that way when we turn it out tomorrow to bake it, it'll be really nice and tall. Then I'm just pinching the sides together. This helps create a little more tension, which will help with that oven spring when we bake it tomorrow. And our dough is ready to go in the fridge. So I'm just gonna cover this with a plastic bag and stick it in the fridge overnight. Before we get this in the fridge though, I do wanna let you know that you don't have to cold proof your dough. You can make this same day if you prefer. Now, the reason why I prefer cold proofing is because it increases the sour flavor, which I like. And also when you bake cold sourdough dough in a Dutch oven, especially, it creates steam, which helps it rise a little bit more. So I just prefer those qualities in my bread. But if you wanted to make this same day, from this point, you would just cover it, let it rise for another 30 minutes to an hour or so, and then bake it as usual, which I'll show you how to bake it here in just a few minutes in this video. But for now, what I'm going to do is cover this, put it in the fridge overnight, and I'll see you in the morning. We officially have a beautiful bowl of fresh milled Einkorn sourdough bread. Now the scoring I keep pretty shallow, maybe no more than like a 1/4 inch or so, just because it doesn't really expand that much, so I don't want to cut too deeply into it, but it still looks really beautiful. But let's cut into this and see what the inside looks like. This is looking pretty good. So there's a few things I want to show you here about this crumb. So first of all, let me see if I can get you a better look. So first of all, usually fresh milled flour has this tight crumb. A tight crumb in bread is one that does not have big holes. An open crumb has big holes, a tight crumb has small holes. It's pretty normal for fresh milled flour to have a tight crumb. But one thing I want to note here too, and this is a little bit of troubleshooting and a problem on my part, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little bit of like gumminess down here where it's a little dense. That is a pretty typical sign of underproofing. Now, that doesn't really ruin the quality of this bread. It's so minimal, it hardly matters. And I almost always toast this anyway, so it kind of doesn't matter. But when you see gumminess like that in your bread, that sometimes means it has not been proofed long enough. And I tend to do that sometimes when things start getting late. I just need to get the show on the road. So I probably rushed that in the end just a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. So if you do see gumminess like that in your bread, that just means next time let it proof a little bit longer. And you can see it still has a nice round full shape. This is a perfect size and a perfect shape for things like sandwiches or any other thing you want to use bread for. So using that 7-inch Banneton basket really helps hold that shape. And then looking at the top here at the scoring, you can see that there's not a big leaf or ear. I found that with fresh milled flour, it's a little hard to get that coveted leaf or that coveted ear where it flips up on top, but I kind of like that anyway, because whenever I have that, I find the bread's harder to cut. It's not as versatile. So I just kind of like that it's a smooth, pretty top to it. And now we got to taste this stuff. Okay, it's the moment of truth. That's really good. That little bit of underproofing at the bottom doesn't affect the quality, of this bread at all. The texture of this is almost like a hybrid between a classic sourdough and a sandwich bread. It's a little chewy like a classic no-knead sourdough bread, but it's also really soft like a sandwich bread. So this is a really great, versatile, everyday bread. If you are ready to make this bread and you don't know where to begin, I recommend downloading my free sourdough starter ebook. It is 30+ pages of how to make a sourdough starter, how to make your first loaf of bread, and more. The link for that is in the description box, as well as a lot of other links I have for other fresh milled flour videos and tutorials and guides on YouTube and my blog. And if you want to make this fresh milled Einkorn sourdough bread, you can get the recipe over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. Anytime I have a tutorial like this, the finalized finalized recipe is always over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. Sometimes I do make tweaks and changes between the video and then publishing the recipe on my blog, but the blog is always the most precise and accurate version of the recipe. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.